Good evening, everybody. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and I'm going to cover a topic tonight you might not think is very, very important, but actually it is, okay? But before I do, I'm going to tell you a couple things. Number one, I am not like other YouTube channels that's going to tell you, hey, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button because it's going to share the video more. Actually, I don't know who told all these people all this, but that's not the case. We do want you to subscribe, and if you want to like the video, that's fine. But the two most important things you could do for me tonight is, number one, watch this video all the way through. And the second thing you could do for me is to actually leave me a nice comment down here in the comment section below. And the reason why those things are important is because those are the two things that get my videos shared around on YouTube. Why? Because YouTube is trying to see how long you stay on their platform, to see if my videos are keeping you on their platform. If they are, they share them. Otherwise, they don't. So, unlike other YouTube channels, I am not going to tell you to hit the like and subscribe, because even though they're nice to have, they aren't going to make that much of a difference when my videos get shared. Watch time and an increase in watch time and nice comments on my videos, that does change things. So if you really want to change things on this video, leave me a nice comment, watch this video all the way through, and encourage your friends to do the same thing. Alright, the other thing I'm going to tell you is that I have published 5 Kindle books. If you want to buy any of them, you let me know in the comment section below, and I'll send you a link to them, and you can buy them. Okay? Alright. Now then, why would you need to know about the unipolar transistor? Well, if you have a solid state drive, you're going to see the letters MOSFET. Well, unipolar transistors are also known as the field effect transistors. And this is vital to know because this is the reason why. You see, when you had the old hard drives, what you actually had was a little disc like that. Okay, it was a spindle disc, and it worked a lot like a record player. You had this little record arm here, okay, and the disc would spin and the record arm would read whatever was on the disc. Well, that's not the way it is anymore. Okay? You say, well, what about these new solid-state drives? Why are they so different? Oh, I'm going to explain that to you in this video tonight. Why you need to know about unipolar transistors, and I've already covered transistors kind of in great detail on my YouTube channel so far, but now we're going to get into the big one. Okay? So the FET part of MOSFET, okay, because I got to do one more video about MOSFET. The FET part is Field Effect Transistor. That means your data is stored on Field Effect Transistors, not on a spinning disk. And that creates a nightmare if you're trying to retrieve your data, especially if your hard drive gets corrupted somehow. There you go. Now, to begin this video, I took some notes here. I said, do you recall my discussion about the bipolar transistor? I have a video about bipolar transistors, and if you want a link to that, just let me know and I'll send you there. Okay, I may even put one here at the end of this video. And let's go on. The bipolar transistors, from what I understand, were actually created before the unipolar transistors. If I got that information wrong, you can leave that in the comment section below and I'll make whatever adjustments in the next video. Okay? In this video, I will show you how unipolar transistors were created and what these transistors actually do. Now, there are several names involved in the creation and the history of unipolar transistors. The first name is Mr. Julius and Edgar and Lilienfeld. There you go, Julius Edgar Lilienfeld. Okay? Now, this gentleman was born in Ukraine in 1882. That was a long time ago. Okay? He studied physics at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin, Germany. He finally received his doctorate in 1905. In a short period of time, he became a professor at the Leipzig University, or Leipzig, or whatever. I don't know how to pronounce that university's name. In the early 1920s, Mr. Lilienfeld, this guy right here, decided to travel to the United States to fight for patents on his X-ray tubes. He also spent some time in New York, where he took temporary assignments from the New York University. It was during his time visiting the state of New York where he conducted some experiments and somehow concluded that semiconductors would someday replace vacuum tubes for electronics. Now, no one is exactly sure how he came to that conclusion. If you want to research that for yourself, please go ahead. Now, Mr. Lilienfeld studied vacuum discharges and field emissions. If you're wondering what a field emission is, then let me try to explain. I may not get this exactly right, but we'll try. Field emissions are emissions of electrons due to generated electrostatic fields. Okay, let me say that again. Field emissions are emissions of electrons. Okay, and you have to keep in mind, when you have atomic structures, you can have protons, which are positively charged particles, neutrons, which are negatively charged particles, and electrons. Oh, okay, sorry, scratch that. Let's try it again. You'll have protons, which are positively charged, neutrons that don't hold a charge, and electrons, which are negatively charged. Okay, so hopefully you got that one right. Anyway, field emissions are emissions of electrons due to generated electrostatic fields. When vacuum tubes were created, electrons were discharged due to some kind of material being exposed to a heat source. Field emissions work in a similar way, but as I said before, electrons are discharged due to a material that is exposed to an electrostatic field. Now, I'm going to put a hyperlink in the description box of this video that will further explain how these electrostatic fields work and how field emissions work and the whole 9 yards. It'll explain a lot better than what I'm doing in this video, but at least now you know what's going on. Now, according to the web article I'm providing to you, and that, I'm going to provide two of them, okay? Provide two web articles here. Mr. Lilienfeld submitted a patent request to the Canadian government in 1925. This patent request was due to his work on the method and apparatus for controlling electric currents. He filed the same patent in the United States the very next year. This patent was finally approved in 1930. Although Mr. Lilienfeld's patent was approved, there is no evidence that he ever created a prototype field effect transistor or attempted to control electric currents with any apparatus. So we have to continue our discussion with a second person's name. Okay? And who's this second person? Well, his name is Mr. John Bardeen. Okay? Now, Mr. John Bardeen was born 2 years after the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Mr. Bardeen was born in the state of Wisconsin. That's this guy right here. Okay? And if you don't know, Wisconsin is very famous, the state of Wisconsin is very famous for producing cheese. Mr. Bardeen had 4 other siblings. His father was the dean of the University of Wisconsin Medical School, and his mother was an art historian. Mr. Bardeen's academic achievements were well known. In elementary school, he was promoted 3 grades at the tender age of 9 years old. He quickly moved through high school and began attending the University of Wisconsin. He pursued an electrical engineering degree. Mr. Bardeen learned quantum mechanics from Professor John Van Vleck. Okay? So we got another name we got to tell you about. So here we go. There's his name, John Van Vleck. Mr. Bardeen finally acquired a Bachelor's of Science degree the same year that the stock market crashed in 1929. Mr. Bardeen was hired by the Gulf Research and Development Corporation. One of Mr. Bardeen's professor, Mr. Bardeen at that time had a professor, and his name was Leo Peters. There you go. Alright. So Mr. Bardeen's professor, Leo Peters, was also hired by the Gulf Research and Development Corporation. Mr. Bardeen studied oil prospecting. During World War II, magnetic surveys were developed. The technology behind the magnetic surveys benefited from the advent of what was at the time called modern aviation. Mr. Bardeen utilized magnetic surveys to interpret geological features. This benefited the financial bottom line of the Gulf Research and Development Corporation. But this wasn't the last achievement of Mr. Bardeen. Oh no. During the Great Depression, Mr. Bardeen left the Gulf Research and Development Corporation and began taking courses at Princeton University. He studied mathematical physics. Mr. Bardeen studied solid-state physics under the direction of Professor E.P. Wigner. So we got another name here. There's his name. Okay. Before the Great Depression ended, Mr. Bardeen acquired a PhD from Princeton. Mr. Bardeen was fortunate enough to work with his former professor, John Van Vleck, which I mentioned earlier. And the two of them worked on solid-state physics. Mr. Bardeen finally became an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, but his career was cut short by World War II. He began to work at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington, D.C. When the war was over, Mr. Bardeen started working at the Bell Laboratory. Now, in case you don't know who the Bell Laboratory is, that would be the phone company laboratory. You remember how they used to have Illinois Bell and you had the Bell Corporation before you had the AT&T, which is American Telephone and Telegraph. Same difference. Okay? Mr. Bardeen began working with semiconductors. That's because they eventually replaced vacuum tubes in all kinds of electronic devices. This would be your televisions, your telephones, your radios. The list goes on and on. Okay? What Mr. Bardeen wanted to know is how semiconductors conducted electrons. Okay? In other words, how electrons went from one place to another and why they generated electric current. And I think I've already talked about that with my videos about watt, volt, and amp. Okay? I've talked about that extensively. It was this research that led to the creation of the first modern-day transistor. Transistors are components that amplify electronic signals. They can also switch electronic signals. I will explain all of this in a later video. The advantage of using semiconductors in modern-day electronics is that they are smaller than vacuum tubes. That's why you don't see vacuum tubes anymore. Mr. Bardeen worked with two other researchers. The names of these other researchers were William Shockley. So I'm going to write down William Shockley. Oops. So William Shockley and Walter Brattain. I gotta say it's probably Walter Brattain. These two guys. Okay? Now then, so Mr. Bardeen was working with these two guys at long last at the Bell Labs. These three researchers won a Nobel Peace Prize for their research and for the invention of the modern-day transistor in 1956. If you want to know more about Mr. Bardeen and his work, then you can read this web article, and I've got a web article. You can read all about it. That's going to be a third one down here in the comment section below. Not comment section, but description box below. So how do unipolar transistors work? If you look up the topic of unipolar transistors, you will find the topic of field effect transistors. They're the same thing. That's because unipolar transistors and field effect transistors are, of course, the same thing. If you do any research on field effect transistors, you will discover that they modulate the flow of electrical current. But in this case, what does the word modulate mean? Well, the word modulate comes from the Latin word modus, which means to measure. In this particular case, it means to regulate the measure of electric current. So in other words, what they're doing is they're regulating how much current passes through an electrical circuit. Remember, the electrons move one way and the current actually moves the opposite direction. And you'll remember that if you watch my watt, amp, and volt videos. When you research this topic, you will find the term signal amplification. So what is being amplified in the transistor? Usually you would be amplifying volts. As I stated in a previous video, volts are the force that pushes the electrons through the wire. So if you had 1 volt entering a transistor, then the transistor would amplify that volt. That means it would force the electrons to flow through the wire faster. There you go. In other words, if 1 volt enters the transistor, then you can cause the transistor to send 10, 20, or even 50 volts out of the transistor, which is that force that's pushing the current, and it makes it go faster. The first field effect transistor was called the point contact transistor. And I have more web articles I want you to read, and there'll be links to them in the description box below. During World War II, Mr. Bardeen and his scientist friends quickly discovered how unreliable vacuum tubes were in relation to connecting telephone calls. That's why they decided to experiment with point contact transistors. These scientists used a metal called germanium as the base of their transistor. That's because the metal germanium has an excess of negative charged electrons. Okay? Then these scientists placed a thin layer of some other material which contained an excess amount of positive charged protons. The protons were called holes. That's because this thin layer was deficient in electrons. But their initial experiments were a complete failure. Mr. Bardeen suggested that the failure was due to the semiconductor surface. The electrons on the surface seemed to be blocking the penetration of the electric fields. So they decided to try something different. Since World War II had finally come to an end, they were finally able to obtain some gold. They melted the gold and fashioned 2 gold contacts, but they had to keep the gold contacts on top of the slab of high-purity germanium. So they heated up some plastic and fashioned it in such a way as to keep the gold contacts in contact with the germanium. The voltage flowing through one of the gold contacts modulated the current flowing through the other contact. One of these point contacts was called the emitter, the other was called the collector. A positive electrical bias was applied to the emitter of the point contact transistor. This positive electrical bias enhanced the conductivity of the germanium, or germanium as the case may be, it was connected to. But there is one more piece of information you need to know about this. There was a base attached to the back of this germanium. I must admit at this point that I'm not an electrician, so I don't know exactly how all this stuff works. But I'm sure you can do some research on this topic and share your research with me on the comment section of this video. And I have a couple of videos that I'd like for you to watch to help you clarify everything I just told you. Eventually the germanium was replaced with silicon because silicon could conduct electricity better. In my next video, which will be the MOSFET video, I will begin the discussion of metal oxide semiconductor, okay, let me say that again, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors. Okay? Most of these kind of transistors are called a MOSFET. That's why, because they're a metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. Alright, I hope you will tune in at that time to watch that particular presentation. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please leave me a nice comment in the comment section below. And more importantly, I'm glad you watched to the end, because I think you learned a lot of stuff today. And even though you didn't see a whole lot of illustrations here, there were a couple of videos that I had you watch to further explain all this stuff. And I'm hoping I will go through a better explanation in my next video. So just because there's a lack of illustrations on this one doesn't mean there'll be a lack of illustrations on the next one. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.